Okay, so today we'll start, as I said, we'll start discussing NMR spectroscopy, nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. Right? Nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. So NMR. Now in last day only I told that this NMR is very helpful in the field of medicine through MRI, right, which we usually call MRI. But not only that, it is also most used spectroscopy for synthetic chemists, right. I think if you ask any of the experimental chemists that which spectroscopy would you like to use, if it is only one to detect your compound, in most of the cases, if it is not X-ray crystallography, it is not if the compound does not form X-ray crystallographer, in most of the cases it will be, the answer will be NMR, right. Why it is so? Say, let me draw this one, right. So this, you know, this is ethyl alcohol. Now if this is ethyl alcohol, see, I can detect with, I can do UV visible spectroscopy, IR spectroscopy. In IR spectroscopy, what I will get? UV visible, it will not give up very much information, because these are in ultraviolet region mostly and very high energy bonds, right? But in IR, you will get information about carbon oxygen bond, carbon hydrogen bond, right? But only up to that much, right? So if we subject these to IR spectroscopy, you will get characteristic bonds about carbon oxygen and carbon oxygen hydrogen, but it will not say that how many bonds are there, right? Which is much closer to one another or something like that. But NMR spectroscopy will get those information as well. For example, in this ethyl alcohol, how many types of carbon we have? We have, see, two types of carbon. This carbon has 3 hydrogens and 1 carbon attached to it, whereas this carbon has 1 carbon attached to it, 1 oxygen attached to it, and 2 nitrogens. So there are 2 types of carbon. Right? Similarly, there are 3 types of hydrogen. 3 types, right? 3 hydrogen types. See, these 3 are same type because they are bonded to this terminal carbon, this CH3. But these 2 are the different set. They have different chemical properties than this one, also this one. And this hydrogen is bonded to oxygen, alcoholic hydrogen, so it is different. Now NMR will tell us that this compound have 3 different forms, hydrogens, and will also tell us what is the ratio between them, because see, here the ratio is of the 3 type is 1 is to 2 is to 3, right? So NMR will also give us this information, right? So this is just to say that why NMR is important and all that, right? Now let us go into details. But as I said, see, some terms in this or some conclusions in this lecture may sound arbitrary to you, right? Suppose some term I am using or I am taking some results, right, may sound arbitrary, but believe me, but they have quite strong scientific evidence behind them and they can be proved. But it is not in the scope of this lecture or even this course to go into details of each of them, right? So you have to assume something, right? But any interested reader, I will give you the study material, you can go through them. But as you know that your syllabus, in your syllabus, this spectroscopy is given allotted 8 lectures. I have already consumed 9 for this, so I have to finish it in 2 or 3 lectures, right? Okay, so let's do not delay and go straightly go to this NMR's theory about NMR spectroscopy. Now see, the theory is that some nuclei, so this is the nucleus of an atom, have some mechanical spin. So it is saying that they are spinning. These are spinning, right, like a top. So suppose this is the spinning axis, right, and this nucleus is spinning. Right. Now this gives rise to an angular momentum, and this is denoted by the a spin number, right? The spin quantum number for nucleus, spin quantum number for nucleus, right? This is denoted by I, capital I. Okay. Now NMR active nuclei are those nuclei which have I greater than 0. So it should not be 0. There are some nucleus who have spin number is 0. Right. Let's see what are those cases. Right. Now they are actually, this I is related to mass number, atomic number, right? These two, this mass number and atomic number. And let's say the spin number I. Suppose the mass number is even. This is an even number, right? And say the atomic number is also even. Maybe let us take the example of say 12C, right? The normal carbon, or say 16 oxygen. So you see the 12, 16, these are even. And what are the atomic numbers? These are 6 and 8. So these are also even. In these cases, the spin number is found to be 0. Right? So they are not NMR active. Right? They are not NMR active. Inactive. We will not consider this in our lecture now. But if you have even mass number but odd atomic number, example say 14 nitrogen, see, so you have even mass number, odd atomic number, they might have spin number 1, 2, 3 like this, right? So these nucleuses will have integral positive numbers of spin, right? I mean, this nitrogen will not have 1, 2, 3, all these things. They will have either 1, 2 or 3, something like that. Okay. But if you have odd mass number and this atomic number may be even or odd, whatever it is, right? They can be anything. Right? In these cases, the spin of the nucleus is found to be either half or 3 by 2 or 5 by 2, these things. That is half integrals. Half integrals. Right? Example, see, right? Or 13C, right? Or 17 oxygen, right? 19 fluorine, all these things. Okay, so in these things you have odd number of mass number is odd and the atomic number can either be even or odd. Now most common NMR actives, these are all NMR active, and this is again a bit complicated with integral. We will consider in our course only atoms which have half integrals, and mostly this one. These two examples, the proton, the 1H hydrogen and the 13C both have spin value of half, right? So we'll consider only these things. Now these are NMR active, right? Now what happens with this if we have a positive spin or a positive spin value or a half integral, right? Since this nucleus is charged, right? Nucleus is charged, positively charged. Now this positively charged species is spinning. If it spins, it generates a magnetic field, right? A magnetic field is generated. And how is that generated? So if this is the axis of spinning, this field axis is coincident with this one, right? So this is again coincident like our earth. If the earth is spinning, right? So this small magnetic field is generated around the nucleus, similar to the case of earth, and whose axis is coinciding with the axis of the spin. Now suppose that means we can consider the nucleus equivalent to a very minute magnet, right? And let the magnetic moment of that spinning, due to that spin moment be mu, a very small magnetic moment. Okay. Now each nucleus will have its characteristic mu. The mu of 1H will not be same to 13C or nitrogen, right? They will have different mu's. Now if this magnetic nuclei, suppose these magnetic nuclei, suppose this one is placed in a magnetic field, in an external magnetic field, uniform magnetic field, a very strong external magnetic field, right? Suppose we denote it as H0. This magnetic dipole, now this dipole in the presence of an external magnetic field can assume only discrete positions depending on the I, right? Depending on I, what is the value of I, right? It can assume only discrete positions. I will show by an example. Just for the time being, you remember that number of these orientations, right? Number of orientations of this magnetic dipole, magnetic moment equals to 2I plus 1, right? So this is the number of orientations that the nucleus, the magnetic moment can have in an external magnetic field if the spin number of the nucleus is I. So in our case, I mean, if the case of protein, suppose we take the case of proton, right? 1H, right? So I equals to half. That means number of orientations equals to 2 multiplied by half plus 1. It is 1 plus 1 equals to 2. So we have only two orientations, right? So as the I increases, number of orientation also increases, and things becomes more and more complicated. We'll limit our discussion to spin half only. Okay. Now what are these orientations? Suppose, see, shall I draw it here? Okay, let me draw it in the next page. Okay. Suppose your magnetic nuclei is here, right? And suppose it is spinning. I mean, you don't know, right, in which direction the magnetic the nucleuses are. They are oriented in every possible directions, right? And you are applying the magnetic field in this direction. Okay, so magnetic field is in this direction, your external magnetic field, and suppose the nuclei is spinning this way. Fine. Now this magnetic field will interact, the external magnetic field will interact with the magnetic field produced by the spinning nucleus, and as such this magnetic moment will orient itself. And what are the possible orientations? We have just found out there are two possible orientations. Let us see what are those. Right. It will do it such a way that the resultant magnetic moment is either towards, with aligned parallelly to the field, or it's opposite to the field. See what happens. There may be two cases. Right. So hello, yes, so either it will spin like this. So if you have see a top, right, if you have played in your childhood or now also, if you have seen a top spinning, right, a top, right, if you remember a top, how it spins, right, it do not spin like this with its axis perpendicular to the floor, right, it always have an angle tilt to it, isn't it? That means it moves like this one, and that axis actually forms a circular type. That means it is a conical shape, right? So this one will also do like this, right? And what is the resultant of the moment? Of course either in this direction, right, that is perpendicular, perpendicular to the floor. Similarly, if this one is spinning this way, right, with its axis like this, right, and so the axis is moving around in a cone of say like this, right, and that means your moment, resultant moment, magnetic moment is in this direction. That is, this is called parallel orientation, right? So parallel to H0 applied magnetic field. On the contrary, right, if you have it spinning like this, axis can be tilted like this also, right? So it will span this kind of cone, right, and your resultant will be in this way, in this direction, right? This is called anti-parallel to external magnetic field, right? And obviously you can see that these two spin states will have different energies, right? This state which is parallel will be lower in energy by the amount that is calculated to be minus mu H0. Mu is the magnetic moment of the nucleus and H0 is the magnetic field, and this spin state will be plus mu H0. So what is the energy gap? This energy gap delta E equals to twice mu H0. Okay, so this is our energy gap. Now see, in absence of a magnetic field, they do not split, they are in the same, this magnetic moment, this spin state, they are in the same energy state, they do not split. So in the absence of a magnetic moment, you will not be external magnetic field, you will not be able to see magnetic resonance. This NMR spectroscopy. Magnetic resonance is different thing, we will come to that just now. Okay, so this energy is in the region of radio frequency. Radio frequency region. Okay, so due to this radio frequency region, here if you apply this perfect amount of radio frequency which is equals to this this energy. That means again if you have H nu, right? So nu is the in the radio frequency region. So if you have that particular amount of energy which correspond to this energy gap, you can see the spin change of the nucleus. Remember one thing, that this spin is not of the spin of electron. It has nothing to do with electrons, right? This is NMR spectroscopy, and this spin state is of the nuclear spin state, and this is in the radio frequency region, and this spin state is, you can see, in the presence of an external magnetic field, this spin state splits, and you can transform from one spin state to the other by application of radio frequency. Okay. So this is how we can observe NMR. So this is the basic theory of NMR. But one difference with other spectroscopy is, in the absence of magnetic field, there is no splitting. Fine, there is no energy level difference in these two energy level. And another thing, the energy gap in UV spectroscopy or fluorescence spectroscopy or IR spectroscopy was fixed, right? For a particular compound in a particular condition, the energy gaps were fixed. But in this case, as you can see, this energy this choice is proportional to this external magnetic field, right? That means, suppose when the H0 is 0, there is no splitting, right? And as you increase it, right, this splitting increases, right? So it splits here. When you increase it, the external magnetic field, the delta E also increases. So more the amount of magnitude of the external magnetic field, more will be the splitting. So this is the basic difference with other spectroscopies, right? So it is not a fixed quantity. It depends on the magnetic field we apply, right? And that's why the resonance term comes in. So whatever be the magnetic field, right, when you increase it, this precisional frequency, this, as it is moving around, right, as it is moving around, this also has a frequency, right? This spinning also has a frequency, and these kind of motions, in conical motions, right, when you form a cone of shape of thing, this is called Larmor precession. This is called Larmor precession, right? So this kind of precessional motion also have a frequency. When these two frequency matches, right, when these two frequency matches, then only we can see NMR. That's why the term resonance is there, right? Magnetic is of course due to magnet, right? Nuclear is for nuclear phenomenon. And why resonance? This is because the energy gap will match exactly with that one only when the frequency of Larmor precession matches with that of the radio frequency. Okay, that's why the term nuclear magnetic resonance. Okay, now let's see. Okay, so we can see that this frequency expression we can easily get from here. So we'll keep this in mind. Now let's see how sensitive the NMR is. So if you remember, in our first lecture of spectroscopy, we discussed something about this Boltzmann distribution, right? Population of states, right? N upper by population of the lower, right, equals to e to the power minus delta E by k t. These are our Boltzmann relation, right? Where k is the Boltzmann's constant, 1.38 into 10 to the power minus 3 joule per Kelvin, and T is the absolute temperature. Now at room temperature, this energy gap, right, energy gap depends on, as I said, on magnetic field. Suppose let us take a particular magnet like say 2.35 Tesla, or in this 200 megahertz region of radio frequency, whatever it is, right? So if we take that energy actually corresponds to this nearly 7 into 10 to the power minus 26 joules. Now if you put this here, that is 7 multiplied by 10 to the power minus 26 joules divided by 1.38 into 10 to the power minus 3, sorry 23, sorry not 3, 23, that's what I say, 23, right, into 300. 300 means 23 degrees centigrade, 27 degrees centigrade, right? Okay, if you put this comes out to nearly 1 minus 5. So what is this? This is very nearly can be treated as 1, and as we have already discussed, for any spectroscopy to occur, there has to have a lower population in the upper state, otherwise what will they absorb? Because you know the probability for transition from lower level to this upper level is same as the probability of from upper level to lower level. If one atom goes or molecule goes from this state to this state, another atom can come from similarly from the upper state to lower state, and the energy gap is same, right? I mean, omitting those vibrational structures here, of course it is not there, right? What will have? They will cancel out each other and will not see anything, right? There will be no spectra. Whatever is observed is coming also out, so we will not see anything. Hence there has to have some lower population, so that we have an excess of absorption. We have to have some excess absorption. And what is this? This is very low. This is actually very nearly not 1, I should say. This will come up like 9999 divided by, another 9, 1 2 3 4 5, 1 2 3 4 5, yeah. So this is the ratio, right? So practically this means if you convert it to percentage, what is the excess percentage? The percentage is I think it's 0.001% excess. So however small it is, still there is some excess, and it is due to this excess we see NMR spectroscopy, right? And so it is very difficult to observe NMR spectroscopy at room temperature. That's why how this can be increased, this ratio can be lowered. See, if you increase this temperature, if you decrease this temperature, right, this part will increase. That means there is a negative power, so ultimately this will decrease. Okay, this will decrease lower to 1. So NMR spectroscopy is always done at very low temperature, very low temperature, right? So it helps that way. So it is very, it is inherently insensitive experiment, but it is very useful. That's why people actually do this. Now there are few terms which you need to know. See, as they are very low excess, very small excess of population in the low state, and if you supply continuous radiation, all this a time may come that it will equilibrate. There is an equilibrium between these two states, and that time there is no net absorption, excess absorption. There is absorption continually going on, but at the same time some molecules are also coming down to the ground state, right? As such, if there is no net absorption, that phenomenon is said that it is saturation is happier. Saturation of spin has saturated. But fortunately, there are mechanisms, right? There are mechanisms which are radiationless, So these can come from this upper state to lower state with radiationless. That means, suppose they can, we are not. That means they are not giving away this electromagnetic radiations. They may give out high heat or sound or anything else like that, right? But not electromagnetic radiations. So there are process of radiationless decays by which this excess is reinstalled, right? It is reinstalled. Sorry, any question? Okay, so it is as I said that by these radiationless pathways they are reinstalled. These radiationless pathways are called relaxation processes. Right? Relaxation means relaxation of the spin from upper state to lower state. Now these relaxation processes, as I said, we will not go into details. There are two types. One is spin relaxation. Another is spin lattice relaxation. Okay, so by these two, this slight excess, this excess of lower spin state is reinstalled, and we can see these NMR spectroscopies. Okay, so this was the basic theory of NMR spectroscopy. Now let's see how we can do this. Now see, as we have seen this transition from upper level to lower level, right? And this H nu equals to 2 mu H0. Now this transition actually can be done by two ways, isn't it? See, first is you keep the H0 constant, so that means the external magnetic field is kept constant, and you vary the nu. So you sweep the sample with various radiations of the radio frequency, as is done with any other spectroscopies like IR or NMR, IR or UV. Right? So this is one of the method, and you see at what frequency this absorption takes place. Right? So this is one of the method. Another method can be done. See, you keep the nu constant. So you keep the frequency constant, right? You do not change it. You keep a particular radio frequency, right, there, and you vary the magnetic field. You swipe the magnetic field. Why here this can be done? Because the energy gap itself is dependent on H0, right? So you can easily do that, right? So at some point those things will that particular energy gap will appear where it is matching with that of the your constant nu, right? You can do this. Now herein this engineering thing comes in. It has been found that it is very difficult to maintain a constant magnetic field, homogeneous magnetic field. Another thing is important, that is the magnetic field has to be homogeneous. Why homogeneous? Because if you have a sample here, right? The magnetic field is something here and it is different here, right? If it is H1 here and it is H2 here, right? They will resonate, have different energy splitting, right? And as such they will resonate at different places, different frequencies. So what will happen? They will be very close. The spectral absorption lines will be very broad, right? So this is not our desire. So main thing is the magnetic field should be very homogeneous. Now it has been found that it is very difficult to have a constant magnetic homogeneous field, right? Rather than it is easy to keep the instrument constant instrument in such a way that the mu is your nu is constant. You have a pulse of radio frequency and you vary this external magnetic field in a short region, right? And you maintain the homogeneity there. So as such we'll see that this is much more easier. Now see, the most important thing in the nuclear magnetic resonance is the magnet itself. Magnet is itself is the most important thing. First thing, as I said, that the field has to be homogeneous, right? Inhomogeneity will bring out this broadness of lines. Now another important thing is, again, if you want to try to maintain a homogeneous field, you cannot do it in a very large area. You can do this at a particular time for a small period of time for a very small space. That's why NMR requires very small sample size. Small sample size. In fact, NMR tubes, NMR is done actually in tubes. NMR tubes, like test tubes, if you have seen test tubes, imagine that test tube to be narrow with a diameter of say 5 mm, not even 5 mm, right? 3 mm or 4 mm, like that. Imagine a test tube to be that thin, right? And so these tubes are mostly very narrow tubes, right? And sample is filled 2 to 3 centimeters. Mostly liquid samples are done there. So now our work is to maintain homogeneous field only in this part. That is enough, isn't it? So this is now easier. Okay, now before going into details, if I can show you, here is the actual picture of this your magnetic NMR machine. See, on the right, on the left, I mean, this is a schematic diagram of FT, Fourier transform NMR, right? You see, this is the machine which is shown here. You can see a point is here, no? Here, this space. This is like, suppose if a man stands here, he will not be able to put this here, the sample tube here. A sample tube, that narrow tube is inserted here, right? If he or she have to stand in some chair or something like that and put it here, so you can imagine how long this is, right? And this is the superconducting magnet, right? So here is the magnet, and there is a very small narrow sample chamber in which you can insert the tube, right? And once it is inserted, it is locked there, and then you control it from the computer, right? So after it is done, you get those results like that, and everything else is same like any other spectroscopy. You have a source of radio frequency, you have a receptor for radio frequency and all that things, and Fourier transform is done like IR spectroscopy to time domain, right? to time domain to frequency domain, so that we get clean NMR spectra. So this is the picture of a real NMR. Okay. Now, and this is very costly instruments, right? I think the lowest cost of this instrument will start from around 2 crores and all that, 2 crores, and to maintain this all is all again very difficult, because this superconducting, this magnet, right, has to be kept jacketed around, it has to be cooled and jacketed in liquid helium, and that again liquid helium has to be cooled by liquid nitrogen. So liquid nitrogen has to be replaced every now and then in NMR spectroscopy. So this is very costly type of instrument, and you cannot shut it down. It has to be kept round the clock, it's open, right? So once you shut it down, you have to charge the magnet again. That's the problem. Okay. But in North Bengal we have a machine, in University of North Bengal, right? Okay, so now let's see how it helps in chemistry. Our main importance, viewpoint is that one, right? We have to see what is done for chemistry. Now, see, if this resonance, if you have a sample, again let us go back to this one. Now, it contains protons. Right? These protons, okay, one more thing, right? As these carbons, if they are carbon 12, they will not be NMR active, but if in the sample there is 13C, they will be NMR active, but they will not resonance in the region where this proton resonance, means hydrogen resonance. Why? Because they have their different mu. The mu is different, right, for this one. Okay. So these protons, you have 6 protons. If all the 6 protons resonance in the same frequency, then we will have only one signal, something like this. It is useless. This is useless, isn't it? So you will not get anything. Useful is when we will get different signals of different heights and all that. And here something called this chemical shift comes in. So this does not happen. Actually, NMR is dependent on the chemical environment around the nucleus. So, see, each of the protons have different, not each of this set have same chemical environment, these have same chemical environment, these have another chemical environment. Right? By chemical environment, what do we mean? I mean the electronic environment around it. Suppose these hydrogens are bonded to a carbon, which is again bonded to a carbon, but this hydrogens is bonded to a carbon, which is bonded to a carbon and a oxygen. That means these bond pairs are pulled toward this one. As such, they are more tightly held. These hydrogens are more tightly held than this one, isn't it? So that's why they will give rise to different chemical environments. So suppose you are subjecting this external magnetic field to this compound. Now this orientation, whatever be the orientation, they do not experience the same magnetic field, external magnetic field. The way we discussed here is fine for a single nucleus, is fine. But if you have For example, if you have say 1 ml of this ethyl alcohol, it contains lakhs and lakhs of molecules. That means multiplied by 6, that number of protons. Right? They do not have the same environment, and as such they do not get the same experience the same external field. Why it is so? Because they are actually, these nucleuses are actually surrounded by electrons. These electron moving around in if they are placed in external magnetic field, they also produce a small magnetic field which is perpendicular to this one, right, which opposes this one, opposes the external magnetic field, right. As such, any nucleus actually get the effective magnetic field. As with the Slater's rule, if you remember, they have this effective magnetic field which is equal to 0. This is the called the shielding constant, and this is particular for the environment, right. So, and this is the shielding effect, and due to electronic circulation, this is induced field due to electronic circulation. Okay, and this is actually helpful. This helps us because as the electrons here in this case in a different environment, because they are from in a different type of bond than this one. As such, what changes? The external magnetic field is constant, right? What changes is this one. Now as this changes, this also changes. So this is different for different protons. As such, we have different nus, because this nu is 2 mu by h. Okay, so these also changes. Now as H effective is different for different protons in a different in each molecule, this frequency of resonance is also different, and that's why in case of ethanol we do not get one single peak, we actually get 3 different peaks, right? 3 different peaks. Actually the spectrum is not like that. These have other structures. Is a splitting structure. The peaks are splitted. We will discuss in the next lecture how they are splitted, but for the time being we are telling that for ethanol we get 3 different peaks for 3 different protons. So that's why NMR is so useful. By the number of peaks we can say how many types of proton is there in the compound. Okay, so now we have different peaks. Now as this H0, right, cannot exactly be measured precisely, right? That's why it is very difficult to measure H nu also. We also cannot measure precisely nu, because we cannot measure this one also precisely. So what is the solution for that? We do the relative proton frequency, right? We measure relative proton resonance frequency. What is relative? That means we have a standard, some inert standard is there, we put that in the sample, right, and we find the difference with that standard, right. Now as that so that means we do not have to exactly measure this one, because that will be same, that difference will be same, right. So that's why we overcome this difficulty of measuring the accurately mu or H0 by using standard. In most of the cases we use TMS, that is tetramethyl silane. How does it look like? So it is like silane, tetramethyl silane. So in proton NMR machines, right, when you resonate the protons, this is inactive, NMR inactive, so will be carbon, right, that will be suppressed. So how many types of proton here? You see, why TMS is used? Mostly this is because first point is this is chemically inert, right? So it does not react with anything else. Two is only one kind of hydrogen or carbon. So we will get in proton spectroscopy also one each, NMR also will get only one peak. So there is, because there is only one kind. So because they are all, this is a tetrahedral structure, right? So they are all of equal distance to each other. So they are of similar type. So we'll get only one single strong peak. And in carbon 13 also we'll get only one peak, because they are there is only one type of carbon. Third is it is volatile. Right. So its boiling point is only 27 degrees centigrade. So just after the experiment, right, if you keep your solvent, if you evaporate it or just heat it slightly, right, the TMS will evaporate and will left with your sample. And lastly, it is miscible with most organic solvent. It is miscible with most organic solvent. That's why it is used. Okay. Now, see, since this right, it is directly proportional to H0. As the H0 increases, the shielding will also increase. That means this chemical shift. What is chemical shift? Sorry, I have not defined it. This chemical shift. This chemical shift is this one. This shift from this resonance frequency, this standard, right? This standard. So the chemical shift is also proportional to H0. Right? Okay. So as this chemical shift is also proportional to H0, so if there is two different spectrometers, suppose one is working at 100 megahertz, another is working at 400 megahertz. If these things happen, then it is very difficult to report. So if you also have to tell that in which spectrometer you have used, in which conditions you have to depend, right? So to again overcome this this chemical shift, problem of this chemical shift, another chemical shift parameter is defined as delta. How is delta defined? Delta is defined as HR by HS divided by HR. What is HR? HR is the magnetic field experienced by the reference, that is our TMS, right? And this is our sample, magnetic field experienced by the sample, right? And you divide it by this one, TMS. So this actually cancels out the effect of this one, right? Now this delta is independent of H0, right? Whatever be the H0, it doesn't matter, because you are dividing it by the field of the magnetic field experienced by the standard. Now delta, this spectrometers are usually calibrated by cycles per second or megahertz, right, or hertz or megahertz. So it is actually can be written as delta nu multiplied by 10 to the power 6. Why 10 to the power 6? I will just tell on this oscillating frequency of the instrument. So this is in, if you put this in megahertz, then you no need to put 10 to the power 6, but if you put this in hertz, then you have to put 10 to the power 6. Okay. See, this is of course dependent on the instrument, but again this delta nu is the, what is it? It is the difference in absorption frequency of standard and sample. Standard and sample. Now if you increase the H0, this difference will also increase. Now when the difference increases, this oscillator frequency also increases. So as such, what happens? Now this delta is actually dependent on H0 or the applied field or the instrument, right? It is not dependent on the instrument anymore, right? So in today's lecture, what we learned why NMR is important and what is the basic theory behind it, how sensitive it is. We also learned about the chemical shift and ultimately delta, and in between we learned that why we are using a standard to overcome the difficulty in measuring H0 and nu, right? And why TMS is frequently used as a standard. So in the next lecture we'll deal with the form of the spin-spin interactions, right, and how the NMR is more helpful in interpreting the structure, right? We'll go more into that interpretation part.